Ladies and gentlemen, let's dig right in. Episode number 79 today is brought to you by Espionage, which is a new podcast from the Parcast network. So what do you think when you think of espionage? A lot of people will think code names, deception, maybe some gadgets, and a lot of times it seems like something right out of the movies. But those are actually some of the essential components of being/becoming a spy. In my own personal experience, spies, even though I have limited experience with them, and I don't even know if they would have referred to themselves as spies, but they don't really stick out like James Bond or Ethan Hunt. What's that other guy's name? Jason Bourne. Most of the time, they're pretty ordinary, relatively forgettable, what actually makes them more dangerous. So what does it really take to be a spy? Well, if you tune into Espionage every week, the Parcast Network original show is going to explore the high-stakes world and analyze the missions behind the world's most incredible spies and what brought their covert operations into the public eye. You can find out about real-world spy tactics required to impersonate, exploit, and infiltrate the most confidential places in the world. One of the episodes you can look forward to in the near future is an episode about Larry Chin, one of the CIA's top Chinese linguists who was also China's top spy for over 30 years. And if you surf on over to wherever you consume your podcast media, right now on the Espionage page, spelled normally, Espionage, what you're going to find is their first episode, and it's actually about atomic bomb secrets and the theft of those secrets and the sale to the Soviet Union right underneath the nose and the eyes of the FBI. So search for and subscribe to Espionage wherever you listen to your podcasts, or visit parcast.com, and that is parcast.com/espionage now to take a listen. This episode is also brought to you by Duke Cannon. Yes, I love these guys. I'm stoked that they came back around for another round of ads. What is Duke Cannon? Well, if you don't know, shame on you. But I'm going to speak broadly and say that they are a superior quality grooming goods organization. They're designed for hardworking men and women. They're tested by soldiers, hopefully not used by boy bands. Duke Cannon partners with active duty military to develop their new ideas and review their products. Anything that doesn't meet those high standards of the soldiers, it's not going to happen. It's not going to go into production. And with that, and I would say more importantly, Duke Cannon is committed to giving back to the men and women serving our country. That's why a portion of their proceeds directly support veteran causes. So, when you're using Duke Cannon's big-ass brick of soap, which, by the way, is freaking awesome. The marketing on the box is great. I was about to say flavors, but that's not right. The scents are also amazing. And when it says big-ass brick of soap, that's exactly what it's talking about. So it goes from a big-ass brick of soap to a regular brick of soap to a small brick of soap, and then it's gone. Even though I have not been able to take it through that entire process, and I think I've been using this bar of soap for like 6 or 7 months. So it's awesome. Whenever you're using one of those or their Prima hair goods, this is going to give you, news anchor style quality hair. And they have beard and shaving products. They have, I was about to say lip gloss again, but it's not lip gloss. It's lip protectant like a lip balm. Don't be surprised if you start humming the national anthem. That's how closely tied they are to supporting the military. Now, if you go to dukecannon.com, that's Duke, DUKECANNON.com, and you use the promo code ClearedHot, what you're going to get is 15% off your first order, and then you're going to be stoked. So, go and get that 15% off your first order at dukecannon.com and use the promo code ClearedHot. And the way I'm looking at it right now is all capital letters. It's all one word. And enjoy. My guest for today is a man that I've been looking forward to talking to for quite some time. And I will open by saying I wish we would have had more time. I am a fan of the Power Hour format, but in this particular instance, I would have enjoyed having a little bit more time to unpack some of the nuance that is involved with these topics. But the beauty is, I think that we're going to have the chance for round 2, maybe even round 3. And I think it would be important for us to have those because I believe it's essential for the American people and the American public to understand how private military contractors fit into the warfighting mechanism of the United States of America. And whether or not you agree with them or disagree with them, they are a part of warfare when it comes to not only the current theaters of war, but also the history of the United States of America, and likely the history of warfare since its inception. So my guest today is Erik Prince. Most people will recognize his name as the founder of Blackwater. Most people will also associate Blackwater with PMCs, or like I said, private military contractors, specifically in the realm of providing security. There was some controversy around Blackwater and the mission that they were holding in Iraq. There were two particular incidents where their name definitely rose to the front of the media. One was involving a shooting in a square, and the other one was involving the ambush of one of their convoys where the bodies were then strung up in the city of Fallujah. Mr. Prince is much more than just Blackwater and those private military contractors. Prior to founding the organization, he served as a Navy SEAL on the officer side of the house on the East Coast, and after that, post-military service is when he began or founded Blackwater around providing training venues and then actual training to military agencies, civilian agencies that are in the defense sector, and then also law enforcement. Post 9/11, it shifted more towards the security details in the Iraq area, and most recently, he has been in the news for his thoughts and ideas on potentially privatizing the war in Afghanistan, which is where we spent the majority of our conversation. If we get to sit down for round two, we're definitely going to dig a little bit more into Iraq, and I would say the controversy that surrounded his organization during that time period. But I think it's pretty cool that we focused mostly on Afghanistan and just the role of private military contractors or civilians fighting on behalf of a nation, as opposed to their military counterparts. We agreed on some things, we disagreed on some things, but I think at the end of the day, it was an awesome conversation, and I hope that the listener base has a better understanding of the role that the private military contractor plays in the United States defense mechanism. So I'm going to shut up now and get right into the episode. Episode number 79 with Erik Prince.
Okay, I got the red smoke. Gun run! North and south! West of the smoke! West of the smoke! Okay, copy. West of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now. Come on with it, baby. Give it to me. I need it. You're cleared hot. Copy, cleared hot.
First, thanks for the time. For
be here.
having me out here. This is beautiful. It reminds me of my time in Virginia, which, like I was saying, I miss, but not the humidity and not the temperature. So it's good to visit, not to stay. And I love the fact, and don't like the fact we're boundaried by time, but I think it'll help us dig into it faster. So
we can always go round two sometime as well if it.
I like it. Well, right. Why don't we just start at the beginning? Where you're from, and then your journey into the Navy, and then we can talk about everything after that.
I would say the first formative moment that came from my foreign policy thinking was remembering the helicopters lifting people off the roof of the embassy, or actually the CIA safe house in Saigon in '75. I remember seeing that as a little kid. And then I remember in '76, I had my birthday in East Berlin, and seeing the guns and the dogs and the tank traps and the minefields and everything facing in, literally keeping a people held hostage by communism, was a really formative moment. And I was always a military history buff, paid attention to airplanes and all that sort of thing. And I remember my folks, we went to the Normandy beaches when I was 11, and I ended up being the tour guide. So that was the amount that I had paid
at the age of 11.
At the age of 11. Sword, Gold, Juneau, Utah, Omaha beaches, and Pegasus Bridge, and the whole thing. So I'd always been that kid, kind of a military history geek. I'd always intended to serve in the military. I intended to be a military pilot. And I soloed when I was 16, an airplane, actually 3. On the morning of my 16th birthday, I got my license when I was 17. And I was accepted at both Navy and Air Force, and I went to Navy, and I ended up loving the Navy but hating the Naval Academy.
Not the first time I've heard that sentiment.
I found it to be 150 years of military bullshit, all distilled into into a school. And, but my summer cruise and exposure to the real Navy was, it was fantastic. I liked it. And I still remember the first time I learned of SEAL teams, there was 2 SEAL liaison officers at the academy, and they gave an intro brief to a bunch of us plebes. And they said, and if you want to come down and work out with us tomorrow, come down at 5:30. So I showed up, and they just said, all right, today we're just running a mile. Get a partner. Put him on your shoulders.
Yes.
And I was hooked.
I don't know why I love those stories so much, but I do.
I was hooked, and I remember going to the pool. Now, I grew up in Michigan, on Lake Michigan, around fresh water, and I was just never much of a swimmer. I was very active outdoors. I hunted. I trapped. I ran a trap line in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, hunting muskrats and raccoons. I can't believe the things I did as a 4th and 5th grader, as far away from home on a very cold December morning. I can't imagine letting kids do that today.
You would be in jail if you let kids do that today, I think. You'd get reported, and then the cops would show up at your house shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, I was obviously too young for a motorcycle or anything, so I was out there pedaling my bike miles from the house, and Michigan had real winters. So I grew up doing all that, and played 3 sports a year at school, paid attention, but I'd always just wanted to be in the military. And so, I was hooked by the notion of being a SEAL, definitely redirected me from being a Navy pilot. And then I left the academy, rolled right into a civilian school. And I remember on my exit interview, the deputy commandant said, wow, why would you leave this school? I said, well, I'm going to leave. I'm going to finish school. I'm going to go to OCS and be a SEAL. He said, you'll never amount to much. I said, all right, well.
Famous last words.
Well, I went to Hillsdale College, a small school in Michigan. It's one of 2 schools in the country that accepts no federal funding. So it went from being a federal government school to one that was not $1 of federal money. And that was a good experience. I was a fireman and an EMT, and I would say I learned more about small unit leadership and gaining the confidence of your colleagues more there than kind of the artificial leadership of the Naval Academy.
It was practical instead of conceptual.
Totally practical, and especially coming as a snot-nosed college kid that had never been done before. No college kid had joined the fire department in Hillsdale, Michigan. And so earning their confidence and showing up early and staying late and rolling hoses and doing all that, that was a good leadership, learn to follow first and then hopefully lead. And then I also did body recoveries for the sheriff's department, going through the ice because people ride motorcycles and snowmobiles on the ice in the wintertime, and they always push it on dates, and somebody has to go pull those out. So it's, I suppose that prepared me for the cold weather experiences of Bud. So going into the 55-degree water off Coronado wasn't as bad as 33 degrees.
Yeah, in comparison, it's not nearly as bad. What Bud's class were you?
I was 188. One other...
Everybody's celebrating 188 in the room. Nobody can see.
One other unique twist. I was an intern at the White House before Monica Lewinsky made it popular. And I was... I came to this dinner late, and it was for Jonas Savimbi, who was the leader of UNITA. I was fighting against the Angolans and the Cubans back in the 80s. And I sat down at the last seat left, and to my left was Bob Brown, the founder and publisher of Soldier of Fortune magazine. And I could hardly talk to him because the hearing aids were turned up so loud there was feedback. And so I started talking to the guy to the right of me, and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, I'm going to finish college. I want to go to OCS, and I want to be a SEAL." Why do you want to do that? I gave him the whole thing. He goes, "Well, that's funny because I just retired. I was the commander of Buds." So anyway, he became a great mentor and wrote a good eval for me. And I'm really fortunate it worked out because the SEAL teams was a phenomenal shaping experience, and it definitely made me a lot of who I am today.
I feel the same about my experience too. I joined when I was a junior in high school in the delayed entry program.
Wow.
Which essentially, looking back on it now, filled a bullet point for the recruiter because I couldn't leave until I was 18 anyway and graduated. But she had a good month. And yeah, straight through the SEAL pipeline. I picked my A school based off of how could I get to Bud's fastest.
Yep.
Got to, it was where I wanted to be, doing what I wanted to do, and surrounded by amazing people. I tell people when they ask about the SEAL teams or about my life, that in my opinion at least, there's nothing unique about me, but the people I was surrounded by and the community that I had those experiences in truly was unique and formative in my life.
Yeah, everybody that I've talked to, every kid I've ever given guidance to about joining the military, I say join the most elite unit you can qualify for because you'll be much happier with the people you work with.
And then look for one that's even more qualified would be the only additional advice I would give. Never
exactly.
I caution people against finding the apex or what they think the apex is, because as soon as you find it, you might need to retire.
It's a false summit.
Yeah,
exactly.
And you were an East Coast SEAL, correct?
I was an East Coast SEAL. I had planned to stay. You know, the deal with my dad, he was a very successful entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. He built a huge company, and I never paid attention to his business at all. But the deal was in our family that you could not come to work with a family business. You had to go do your own thing, which was fine because I wanted nothing to do with that. And I went off to be a SEAL, and I was going to do it for 10, 12 years, right? Probably the good years to be a SEAL officer before you get stuck at a desk.
You fly on a desk.
Exactly. And I was going to get out and go do the next thing. Now, unfortunately, my father died early in that period, and my wife then got cancer, and so I, between those two things, when mom and wife are saying, hey, we need a little help here at home, mm-hmm. I got out. And so my time in the teams was definitely cut way shorter than I intended and wanted to. And so it's probably one of the big reasons I started Blackwater was as a way to stay connected. And, SEAL team like units had used private facilities since the 70s, but no one had done it on an industrial scale, right? When I was in the teams, we'd go to Shaw's.
Oh, yeah. Been many times.
And a great facility. But I also I did the math as to how many months a year we were gone, even doing pre-deployment training. So I thought, hey, maybe there's one way we can get a whole bunch more training that guys could still make it home for dinner, at least on the East Coast. And so I was in an unusual position as we sold the family business, and I knew what the need was, and I was in the position to finance it, which every smart person, every smart financial advisor said that was a terrible idea. There's a major base or a range being closed at every military base around the country because of the whole peace dividend. It was long before the war on terror was ever considered.
Yes. What year was this?
Broke ground in 97.
And what year did you exit the military?
Fall of 96.
So
in the last months, I was out looking for land. I mean, where do you find at least 3,000 acres of flat land that's cheap, that's proximal to
Moyoc.
Perfect Navy base? Moyoc.
I've been to the facility. I used it when I was in Green Team.
Well, good. So that was, so my father passed away. I had zero business experience, zero land development experience, zero government contracting experience. But you kind of go back to the well that the couple of the training officers from SEAL Team 8 that I worked with, one of the instructors, Jim Dehart, fantastic guy who'd been managing the facilities at Dev Group for like 13 years. Mm-hmm. And we just figured it out. And
what was the initial intent when you had the idea? And I'm thinking back to you talking about you were going to stay in for 10 to 12 years, which would have been the years that you want to be as an officer because you will get pinned to a desk. 9/11 would have occurred at the very tail end of that for you, I think. So I don't know how satisfied you would have been had you stayed in, depending on where you would have gone and what you would have done.
I don't know, but it is what it is. Built the facility. It was intended to be a private, high-end training facility. I wanted to give the guys a country club-like experience, right? Because when a military unit often goes to a facility, to an army range, it's very bureaucratic, drawing your ammo, and you got a range brief, and then somebody's got to clear you hot, and it's just all kind of nonsense, right? Mm-hmm. Not nonsense, safety procedures are fine, but don't get ridiculously bureaucratic about it. So when you came to Blackwater, you showed up at 8 o'clock, they'd hand you a radio, you get your range safety brief, your ammo would be there, and you were rolling, right? Mm-hmm. It was just like if you go to a country club, you expect the whole place to be done and ready for you, the customer. And, you know, it was tough those first few years, getting a name out and getting a reputation and building it up. But at the same time, I started Blackwater. I took over my dad's original machinery business, which was about 250 employees, and it had gone through probably 10 years of malaise, and it needed to be tightened up and cleaned up. And so going through restructuring that, and, you know, that's where I learned about the Toyota production system, mm-hmm. and, you know, bottlenecks in manufacturing, things that if you come from the government side of the plate, you don't really think about. And so becoming more efficient, buying stuff better, getting rid of the dead wood in an organization was all very good experience as a 26-year-old. So Blackwater starting and struggling along, I'm restructuring businesses, and then Columbine happens. And we immediately, within a couple of months, build a facility called Are You Ready High School, which was a big mock-up of a high school because, mm-hmm. you know, there was dozens of police departments that responded to that Columbine shooting, and they all sat around and kind of surround and negotiate, and they had all the high-end gear, and nobody went in and solved the problem. And, you know, the librarian died 3 hours after the shooters had killed themselves, and he died of what should have been a non-life-threatening wound because nobody went in and solved it. And so we ended up training tens of thousands of police officers to go from the surround and negotiate mentality to solving the immediate threat. And we lumped along. We sold a few more target systems, and then the coal happened, and mm-hmm. then a few months later the Navy came to us, and the Navy had optimized to fight at 100 miles, not at 100 meters. Mm-hmm. And it was so bad, the sailors that were on guard that day were largely holding unloaded weapons that they'd never fired before. Because the Navy, the pendulum in the Navy had swung so far in the direction of safety that it was considered unsafe to shoot live rounds at boot camp. And they were shooting laser simulators.
I was joining the Navy at that point, and I remember their mechanism for safety was just separate the ammunition from the weapons, which, although that does render a weapon safe, it also puts you in an unsafe situation when you're in a foreign port and you need to react to an imminent threat.
And I don't think they really even thought about the idea of a suicide boat driving into their vessel. I mean, from what I understand, many of the sailors were waving at the suicide boat as it approached.
It actually doesn't surprise me, given the time.
Yeah, but you know, on the flip side, the Navy's always done very well with training damage control. And the crew of the Cole did an amazing job of saving the ship that day, once it had been hit. Mm-hmm. But the firearms and tactics side of the Navy had completely fallen off the edge. And so we played, I would say, a very big role in getting the Navy ready for those kind of realities. And we trained close to 100,000 sailors between the BW facility in Connecticut, in Florida, in Bremerton, Washington, and in San Diego.
So at this point...
all safely, I will add.
At this point, so you started Blackwater. It was a facility-based, and then training came from that based off of the environment that the world was thrown at you. Was Blackwater associated, and I ask this because I assume most people will think Blackwater and they'll think security of some kind. Were you guys into that field yet, or was that still on the horizon?
Not at all. We started as a training facility, and were limited there, and it was not really until after 9/11 when... we had a lot of different government agencies came through, and one of them called us a few months after 9/11 and said, "Hey, we really need your help securing a sensitive facility in a very dangerous place." And we responded and did well, and that led to the first 18 guys. I was among them, and we did well there, and that led to hundreds more guys working in those kind of dangerous places, and then. Of course, that was in Afghanistan and environs, and then Iraq happened, and we ended up securing the hunt for WMDs, and then the Bremer detail happened after in August of 2003 when the UN representative in Baghdad was blown up.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. got serious about protecting the perimeter type
yeah.
position. And so we were literally pulled into it and responded because we had a facility that could do the recruiting and the vetting and the training. And because we had the pool of people, of former operator type people that are willing to go there. And then, then the model really built, and I kind of break it down in manufacturing parlance. Just like you have in a factory, you have receiving and you have forming, finishing, fabricating, assembly. In this case, what does the military do? It recruits, it vets, it equips, trains, deploys, and supports people to go into a difficult spot. And because we had a very unique facility, at least in the private sector, and we reinvested almost every dollar the business made back into providing that capability. So our recruiting database grew to 45,000 people. And we had a social media outreach before there was social media. We had something called, it was Gary Jackson's idea, it was called the Blackwater Tactical Weekly. And it was an email blast that went out to everybody. It was a kind of an affinity group newsletter. Terrorist incidents, certain training, lessons learned, gear, that kind of stuff. But if you also needed to find a former Marine sniper that could pack horses and speak Swahili, that was the way to do it.
That was your resource?
Yeah, that was became our recruiting outreach. And then vetting, we built into having our own terminal from the Virginia State Police on the compound for doing all the background checks. And we had our own industrial psychologists on staff and our own medical team, literally doctors on base, on the facility for vaccinations and physicals and all that stuff. And a large warehouse for supply to do, if a guy was going here, he was going to get this basic loadout or whatever the job might be. And of course the training based on whatever they might need. And we built a 5.5 kilometer track and skid pad and every kind of thing. We kind of dealt with all the threats from 1 meter hand-to-hand kind of stuff all the way out to 1,200 for sniper work. And then we bought an air operation. I always had an affinity for aircraft anyway, but especially because of the places we were operating in Afghanistan, air was a key component. And we bought Presidential Airways in the spring of 2003, and that was 6 guys, the licenses, and 1 leased aircraft. I'll never forget, long before we were known, we put out a press release right after we bought the business, and 10 days later, Raytheon called us and said, "Hey, we've got 5 Casa 212s. You want to buy them?" We didn't have any use for them, but they were a great price, and so I said, "Sure, what the hell?" And we went for it. I did
quite a few jumps out of your Casa 212s.
Ah, good. And that was actually that was the baseline of their work was JSOC support.
Yeah,
doing showing up in a more
out in Arizona. Yep,
showing up more reliably than the Air Force would. And that was kind of how our entire air wing grew.
I wish I could say that was a high bar to get over, but I think you and I.
You're right.
And don't get me wrong. I love the Air Force, but I don't know how many times I've been stuck waiting for an Air Force bird.
There are great people in the Air Force, but it's largely become an armed airline union.
Yeah.
And it's a leadership problem. It's not a manpower problem. So anyway, that business grew from
Sounds like it evolved as well during that time period.
It did. Our customers said, "Can you do this?" And we said yes, and we ran hard to make it happen. But from a capital structure, going from 1 leased airplane to 73 that the company owned outright within 6 years takes an enormous amount of cash. And so every bit of money that the security or training or the rest of the business made was plowed into putting that kind of air wing out there. And we still lost a number of aircraft in combat, shot down. So it was, I take real issue when people say, "Oh, he's a war profiteer." You know what? Yeah, the business made money, and I plowed it back into assets that the government needed for its work overseas. And I didn't see anybody else showing up with 73 of their own aircraft. Nobody did that.
Yeah.
Nobody was dumb enough to do that. I did. Kind of led with my chin on that one. But,
I think it ties back into what we were talking about slightly before I started recording, where I don't know if people No, almost nobody, unless you served in the military overseas, is going to have direct experience with private military contractors or organizations like that are into the void filling a need that, rightly or wrongly, the U.S. government is not capable of filling. And there's a whole discussion about whether or not the government should even participate in those activities if they can't sustain them on their own. But I think it's an important thing to educate people about what it takes to fight a two-front war for nearly 2 decades.
And not only that, fighting a two-front war with the wrong stuff. We have a magnificent conventional army, right? Look what the Army did rolling, and the Marine Corps did rolling from Kuwait to Baghdad against the full might of the Iraqi army. They smashed the hell out of them. But now when you retask an armored division into being a peacekeeping force, come on. You're trying to retask a chemical weapons specialist or an air defense artillery guy into being a bodyguard or a police trainer. It's and it comes to, and also there's a huge fundamental difference between the soft community that we came from versus a conventional military. In a conventional military, you man the equipment, right? Because it's the artillery, the rockets, the armor that does the fighting and the killing. In a soft unit, you equip the man because the man is the weapon system. And so the soft guys are able, because of the much greater amount of training concentration they have, to be a versatile Leatherman tool versus a purpose-built tool that does one thing really well in a conventional force. That's part of the mismatch. And so whether the military had 200,000 or 500,000 troops in Iraq after the defeat of Saddam, it didn't matter because it's the wrong people. And especially when you have a tooth-to-tail ratio, right? So if you consider the purpose of a combat unit is to engage with the enemy, you have an enormous, the support tail in a conventional unit now has gotten really kind of crazy. It's about 12 support for one tooth. And that's why the mix and the kind of the hyper bureaucracy of how the conventional military operates in Afghanistan or Iraq or those places has not been very successful. The soft model applied in Syria and limited only to soft guys, that's worked pretty well. What worked well after 9/11? 100 SOF and CIA case officers backed by air power, working with the Afghan tribes and militias. They smashed the hell out of the Taliban in a matter of weeks. But when 6 months, when the first 6 months as the conventional units rolled in, we basically replicated the Soviet battle plan and have been losing. So when you look at the speed and flexibility, right, you have maximum combat power in a conventional unit. You have much more flexibility in a soft unit. You have less combat power, but even more flexibility in a contracted capability. Whether it's you need to get trucks, or you need to get a well drilling team, or you need to get airlift, or contractors can move and rent and acquire as necessary, and put kind of practical, cheaper, sustainable stuff in place. So we had a couple of those CASAs in Afghanistan doing plane airlift missions, flying from one base to the next, dropping off stuff. And one day, the support guys from the 82nd Airborne came to us and said, hey, we have a company-sized unit of the 82nd pinned down, and they're running out of ammo. Okay, they're in a big firefight in some valley, and the Air Force wouldn't drop. Okay, the U.S. Air Force would not do their job with a $100 million C-130J model because it wasn't a surveyed drop zone. And they asked our guys flying a $1.5 million CASA, would they do it? And they said, of course. And they were actually bush pilots from Alaska. They threw the pallets in the aircraft, and within an hour, ammo was landing in the perimeter of that 82nd Airborne unit. And a contract led to that because, again, our guys, customer service focused. What does the customer need? Yeah, we'll do it. And it also takes having the right people that love to do that kind of flying, right? Like with anything, it's about finding the right people.
Yeah.
And so you get a fairly dispersed performance of contractors as well, based on the ownership group and the leadership of the company. Look, I leaned on our folks that we never ever want to look like our customer, and we never want to look like a Beltway company. And maybe the Beltway hated us for that, but I know the people we supported loved us for that because we showed up on time every time.
Where do you think the line sits, in your opinion, between somebody in the military and somebody contracted to work for and with the military. And I think we have to differentiate the type of contractors. You know, there's direct agency hires, guys who are working for the agency, and they're basically separated by a tax code for all intents and purposes. They're representing the agency, wearing the uniform of the agency. And then I would not put them into the category personally of a private military contractor. They're a direct hire to the agency essentially. Then you have the soldier or sailor, fill in the blank, service member on the other side of the house who's wearing the uniform of the nation. And then in your mind, the role of the PMC or private military contractor, the people that you are describing in the product that your organization was, I don't want to say producing, it was enabling, where should their lateral boundaries be, in your opinion?
I sometimes refer to our organization back in the day as the DRMO of manpower, right? DRMO is
Defense Reutilization Management Office, right?
It was basically where you'd, reuse an old truck or tent or whatever. And so what does a guy do that's a Marine Corps machine gunner with his 6 years of experience? What does he do with that experience in the private sector?
Absolutely no idea.
Right? Now, if you're a nuclear power petty officer on a submarine, yeah, you can go work for a power company. Or if you're a pilot, you go work for the airlines. But we provided a way for the skill sets people used in the military to reuse them and to monetize them and to have more control over their life, right? We were the ultimate volunteer organization because we couldn't stop lost people. They had to volunteer to go do the job for us every day to leave the wire to do something dangerous. And our guys were only paid for every day they were in the hot zone, not just for being employed by Blackwater. They had to be in the hot zone. Where is that line? If you look for conventional formations to do state-on-state warfare, that absolutely should remain in the sole realm of the uniformed forces. Okay? But fortunately or unfortunately, that's not how most warfare is going to be.
I think those days are gone, personally.
It is, especially state-on-state warfare versus with
like
countries,
linear battle formations with tank. I think that day is like it's
especially in countries armed with nuclear weapons, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Look at how many state-on-state warfare there's been in countries armed with nuclear weapons. Zero. It's all been hybrid, brushfire, kind of small wars all over the place, where the flexibility to go from contracted or intelligence service capacity building is much more flexible. In 2011, I was invited to go to Russia, and I met a bunch of high-level Russians, and they really wanted me to build a Blackwater-like facility there. So I obviously said no, but I thought it was a very interesting approach, and it's kind of a precursor to what they did in their hybrid warfare realm, and they've done a very good job of maximizing the talent coming out of the Russian forces and reusing them in a contracted way, and that's how they did Crimea and the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, in Syria. They're in Central African Republic. They're in Mozambique. They're in Libya. They're in Sudan, and they're in Venezuela.
Do you think that's a model the U.S. should replicate?
I think it's as old as warfare itself.
But do you think it's a model that the U.S. should replicate?
I think it's an inevitability.
How do we?
And why? Because it provides the continuity. And so we can, segue to Afghanistan.
Sure.
I've been quite vocal about what we should do in Afghanistan.
I read the article last night.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm not sure which one that was because I've done a lot of them. But
it was the one you wrote. I want to say it was Washington Post or New York Times. It's one of the two.
I did write an op-ed for the New York Times.
Correct. That's the one I read last night.
And here's the thing.
Macarthur's plan for Afghanistan, I believe.
That was in the Journal, Wall Street Journal. And and even since I wrote that, I've fleshed out the plan significantly deeper than that. One of the biggest problems in Afghanistan the United States has faced is no continuity, right? It's because we've been sending conventional units because we overwhelmed the amount of SOF that we could even send. So they send, I would say, the wrong units, conventional units, looking to fight that linear battlefield, which doesn't exist in Afghanistan. And they send units that largely consist of 18 to 22-year-olds that have never been outside of America before. And they send them to Afghanistan, and they're getting to learn the area for 3 or 4 months. And then they're productive for a few months, and then the last month they spend doing inventory, packing up, shipping home, maybe 1 week or 2 weeks of turnover, lift and shift, an entirely new unit comes, and start again. And we've done that rotation 30 times now. No continuity at all. The difference, what I advocate, is using Special Forces veterans that have largely been in that country before that will contract for 3 and 4 years. Okay? But they're going to go back to the same battalion, in the same unit, in the same valley, live with, train with, patrol with, and even fight with. Okay? Serving in the Afghan chain of command, providing leadership, intelligence, communications, medical, logistics expertise. The key enablers that if a unit doesn't have, the unit falls apart. If one of those things falls apart, the whole unit falls apart. That's the model. It's basically the soft model enlarged. And you could say, why don't the U.S. Special Operations Forces do that? Because there's not even enough of them to do that in that model. But there's a lot of veterans that have done it, that are willing to do that, and we can pay them very well to take those risks, and they'd be living rough. Right? But I'm not going to send them for 2 years straight. I'd send them in for 90, home for 30. Back in for 90, home for 30. Always rotating a pool of 36 people per battalion. So maybe that's a total of 50 people. But you're always keeping 36 on station, keeping that continuity so they know the good mullah from the bad mullah. They live with and they support that local population. And believe me, they have every incentive to make sure the unit is well prepared and trained and led, and that they don't abuse the locals, because the locals will abuse them. Okay?
Who would be lead in those operations, the Afghan or the Americans?
The lead mentor would be an American. They would effectively be the quasi commander. It's kind of like the mentoring role where you have a U.S. soft guy next to his Afghan counterpart.
That's why I asked, because I've lived that myself, and I'm intimately familiar with the struggles that are associated with that.
And it's not a perfect model, but the continuity and well, at the end of the day, the expat advisor is going to be the one writing the evaluation for the unit, for those people, so that you have a merit-based evaluation, not one based on tribe or religion or how much somebody's paying for their position, which happens all the time. If you do that with long-term mentors that can call on reliable air power, and not...
Who would provide that?
Again, a contracted capability. I had 56 airplanes in country doing this kind of support for the U.S. military, for the largest military in the world, and they still needed the right kind of help, okay? You don't need a $120 million C-130J model when a $2 million CASA will do, or a $1 million Antonov 26, right? It's an old Soviet era aircraft. Look, if you have reliable lift and medevac, resupply, and yes, even CAS, right? First thing I learned in the SEAL teams was travel light and call in your might. But
I like it.
But the problem is...
In theory and concept, I like that for sure, because we operate in such small elements.
Exactly. But and how did 100 SOF and CIA guys smash the hell out of the Taliban? Because they had reliable air power that showed up. But again, this model of mentors operating under Afghan chain of command, aircraft operating under Afghan chain of command, they're not part of the KAOK. They're not part of the whole air plan run out of Qatar. I think it's not a serious way to wage war if troops in contact in Afghanistan have to get permission from a lawyer sitting in an air-conditioned cubicle in Qatar to drop a bomb.
That wasn't my experience, and things might have changed in my time. The rules of engagement certainly tightened, but they also tightened because of the number of CivCAS incidents, which I'm not going to apply no fault whatsoever. I don't think people realize how gray war is. There is no black and white.
It is tough, no question. But again, we have the wrong aircraft doing the mission. There's been 0 aircraft shot down by missiles. There's been 92 aircraft lost to ground fire.
Yeah.
Okay? That's machine guns and RPGs shooting down helicopters. So the idea that you have to be at 25,000 feet to drop a precision bomb is really crazy. And the approach that we would use in air is largely troop in contact, base defense. Because the model has been, the last 5 years, is the Taliban rolls in with 200 or 500 guys, and they surround a base, and they lay siege to it, and nobody comes, and no CAS comes, no resupply comes, not even medevacing their dead or their wounded. And so after 3 or 4 days, that poor base commander surrenders, hopefully to not get slaughtered, and that's how so many of these bases have been lost in so much terrain. If you have air that will show up reliably and do do a modern version of a fire force, right? I mean, the Taliban that are moving in there are not moving on a highway. They're moving on a dirt road or a simple track by 4-wheel drive or maybe a motorbike. That we can't move blocking forces, even small ones, in to pin them in and destroy them. If they want to give us a conventional battle, fine, give it back to them hard. But we don't even seem to do that anymore.
But do you think it's the role of an American civilian to fill that void?
Here's the thing. Like I said, it's as old as warfare itself. And if you go to Washington, D.C. sometime and you look across the street from the White House, there's Lafayette Park, with statues of Lafayette, Rochambeau, Von Steuben, Kosciuszko, foreigners that came here and built the Continental Army, and they did the same model. They lived with, they trained with, they patrolled with, and they fought with, side by side with their American counterparts. Von Steuben was the first Inspector General. Kosciuszko was the founder of American artillery. He was key to the defenses at Saratoga and West Point, which were really the first victories the colonials had over the Brits, which convinced the French to send support. So it's literally how the country's military was formed. So there's lots of other examples. If you think about... and
I can't argue any of them, and not to cut you off at all. I can't argue the historical usage of it, and I agree that it can have some enabling power. My concern, personally, and again, this is just my my point of view, is that I think if the country cannot effectively and efficiently fight the wars with which we've chosen to engage in, or that by necessity we need to engage in, I would rather see the military and the country take a step back and fix the problem, as opposed to having a civilian step into the void. And I have no problems with civilian. I mean, I'm a civilian now too. But to me, at least in my opinion, those who fight war should be issued the flag on their shoulder and be wearing the uniform of the nation that they're fighting for.
I'm not asking for civilians to fight conventional state-on-state wars, but for the long-burning problem areas, history would show that the private sector approach to doing this is largely the only way to put these fires out.
They're certainly more nimble. I mean, coming from a soft perspective, if you compare and contrast soft versus conventional, you're largely comparing and contrast private versus the bureaucracy of the United States military. The ability to be nimble, to deploy quickly, to have that firepower. I certainly understand it. In Afghanistan, I was reading in your article you were recommending, it was 2,000 special operations, U.S. special operations and around 6,000 contractors.
Yeah. It's about 3,600 mentors.
Yep.
Okay, staff positions across 92 battalions, some support for them, and of course some guys to run about 90 aircraft. That's fixed and rotary wing, including strike aircraft, but again, Afghanizing it, two-seater strike aircraft, so that any bomb or any weapon that's released is always the Afghans' decision. It's not a contractor pulling the trigger. So if we believe...
In theory, I think that works. But again, having worked with partner forces in Afghanistan, it's not generally the reality that I experience. So we were partnered up sometimes at 2-to-1 with an Afghan partner force, and I'll be honest with you, when we were looking at helicopter load, we obviously had to take a certain amount of Afghan personnel, but we, instead of working with them, because a lot of times we couldn't, whether it be a language barrier, a technology barrier, an ethical barrier, a motivational barrier, it ended up being, regardless if we were side by side, there was a lot more action and activity taking place on one side than the other. And a lot of the time, those individuals basically would just defer to the American soldier that was there. So I'm not saying it couldn't work, but I do have my concerns with the Afghanizing of it, just because of what I've seen with my own eyes.
It's not a perfect solution, but I think it's better than what we've been doing for the last 17 years. I don't think anybody could argue that what we've been doing there is a great success story that we want to replicate.
I'll be the first to admit I don't think the U.S. military has a solution for it.
Look, if you look what the East India Company did for 250 years, now it did some things great, it did some things not great, but their model of building indigenous forces was a model of 19 locals, one foreigner who would live with, train with the same thing for years. They would operate like that. And in the places that the East India Company did, look, when they rolled into parts of India, they stopped the Muslims and the Buddha and the Hindus from slaughtering each other and from burning mosques and temples. They did away with sati, which is a horrific practice of wife burning, right? If a male died, they would burn the wife.
Jesus.
The East India Company banned that and prevented it. They ended basically warlord prisons where, you know, people were thrown in prison for being poor or whatever else. They did away with that. The East India Company put in massive amounts of irrigation and turned many millions of hectares arable then because of the water they could provide. So that, you know, the East India Company was not there to fight. They were there to trade and to build an economy. And ultimately, it's employment and sucking away manpower from the fighting force to make them to go to work. And as I look at the total failure of the U.S., largely because of that lack of continuity and because it's largely flag officers making that decision that have no understanding of business or why building a mine or a farm over a medium to long-term decision to do that, why that's so important in the security elements that have to be provided for. A conventional military officer or even largely a SOF officer says, okay, I'm going to control this terrain. And they don't look at it like an entrepreneur would to say, what are the arteries through which the economy flows here that we need to make sure it still works and make sure it works to our benefit and not to the enemy's benefit. I mean, the Taliban is making about $600 million a year in between illegal mining and illegal drugs.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
so
you're driving around that country.
More than enough to...
well, the conventional military, and I would say even a soft military officer, is not taught to think in terms of
they get no business
economy
training at all.
Well, and I would say that's where I think the role of other direct organizations inside of the U.S. military should be paired with those individuals. The East India Company is an interesting example. I mean, it didn't actually go that well for them in Afghanistan, though. Nope,
they didn't have air.
Well, nobody did in the 1839 when they invaded.
No. But you know, the terrain definitely served the benefit of the Afghan locals.
But it still does. And, it was funny. I was actually just kind of researching their involvement there. You know, when they went in 1839 and reduced their forces to about 8,000, the first realization they came to was we need more people. And also they didn't have air, but their enemy doesn't necessarily have air right now either. But it's an interesting country, and it's a problem. It's unfortunate that we still can't find a solution. What are we now, 170 years later?
Indeed.
It's I'll be the first to admit, like I've said, I look back at my time in the military and I wonder whether or not the actions that I was a part of or the actions that I took actually stabilized or did anything, because I look at my own children and what I want more for them than anything is to not have to live through the world that I did or inherit a world that is better. Or my worst nightmare would be they'd have to go continue a fight that I started.
Look, I wrote that op-ed in the Wall Street Journal because I have at least two sons that are probably going to join the military. And the idea of them going to Afghanistan at year 19 or 20 to get blown up or dead in a poorly run war, I wanted no part of it. That's why I wrote that article. I got enough things to do in my day job.
I suspect you do.
Than worry about Afghanistan. But for every parent, every taxpayer, every American that cares about the survival of civilization. And why does it matter? Because if the U.S. pulls back and it becomes truly the terror sanctuary shit show that it would become, right? I mean, even the President Ghani of Afghanistan said the government wouldn't last 6 months without the U.S. I would say it's more like 6 weeks.
I was going to actually say roughly the same thing. I think 6 months is a dart thrown against the wall.
Right. So we have to get something right there. We need to get something to keep the lid on. And what I've tried to lay out is a rationalization plan. It's not a privatization. There's 15,000 U.S. troops and 30,000 contractors, but most of those contractors are there to support the very expensive U.S. presence. By dialing it way down to just what's necessary to support the ANSF, one of our first jobs overseas doing high-end security was to support a remote base for the U.S. And we rolled in there with 25 guys. And we replaced 168 soldiers. The Army had 28 there for security, a rifle platoon, and all the rest, another 140 people supporting the 28. The 25 I sent, 5 of the guys were dual-hatted to keep the power, the water, the sanitation, the communications, and the food going. And it all just worked. Basically no loss in combat power and a heck of a lot less mouths to feed.
Yeah, it's hard to describe to people the bureaucracy involved in the U.S. military unless you've tasted it. or
and again,
been burned by it.
But again, that U.S. military is designed for a linear battlefield, for maneuver warfare. Okay, third generation war. Mount up. What did the U.S. military train and equip for from 1945, really to the present? A maneuver warfare to defeat the Soviet Union rolling across Western Europe. Full stop. Okay, the Apache helicopter was designed to maneuver behind the Abrams tanks moving across Europe. The Humvee was designed for all-terrain mobility across Northern Europe. All of those equipment and systems were designed for that fight. Not designed to fight two guys in a pickup truck on a hillside in Afghanistan. And so applying that super expensive footprint to fighting against guys, it's I've said it before, it's like mowing the lawn with a Porsche. You can do it, but it's hard on the Porsche and it's not very effective.
Yeah, I agree. The stumbling point that I come to personally is whether or not, again, to outsource the solution or retool the U.S. military and solve the problem that the military is having. One, given the scale and scope of what the military is, I don't know if that's possible. I don't know what timeline it would occur on. But I guess at a not at a moral level, and not necessarily at an ethical level, but a combination of the two, I get concerned with the outsourcing of warfare, even though historically throughout warfare it has happened. Because, I mean, the issues that come up, I think, and rightfully so, that should be at least discussed are when it comes to accountability and who do those, and that's where we were talking before, the difference between, private military contractors and the term that I've seen thrown towards you and your organization often, and I think people are using it pejoratively because I think it's a snipe, is mercenary.
Sure.
And in your opinion, what you just described, those that are going to be able to fight side by side with the Afghans they would be partnered with, what would they, in your mind, what is the difference between a private military contractor and a mercenary, or is there one, or does it matter?
Well, here's the thing. When they were throwing the mercenary term at Blackwater, they were completely inaccurate because in that case we were using American military veterans to serve their own country in a U.S. military contingency operation. So even by the Oxford Dictionary definition, it doesn't meet the term mercenary. Now, an American contracted to the Afghan government supporting the Afghan security forces, sure, that would by definition would be a mercenary. But so what, right? When General Westmoreland, okay, the guy that screwed up in Vietnam, and then the Army promoted him to be Chief of Staff of the Army, sounds a familiar tale, screw up and move up in the U.S. Army. He was debating against Milton Friedman over going to an all-volunteer force. Imagine. And Westmoreland said, I don't want to lead an army of mercenaries. That's what he called a all-volunteer army like we have today, because the people would be paid a market wage for their service.
And you also have to take into account only about 10% of those are combat forces, though. I mean, the vast majority of the military are not actually engaging in direct combat of any kind.
True.
So,
but here's the other dangerous and expensive fact of that. 10% of the armed forces in combat arms, or of the ground forces. Of that, 10% actually see ground combat. 40% of the people getting out of the U.S. Army are claiming battlefield injuries, PTS and TBI and all the rest.
Yes, this is a discussion in and of itself. I know exactly what you're talking about.
No, because so sadly, a lot of guys have legitimate injuries and they deserve the absolute best of care. But when malingerers figure out the code words to get themselves a long-term disability for claiming an injury is really wrong, and the taxpayers are on the hook for another $1 trillion. Trillion. Yep. U.S. didn't reach peak healthcare spending for World War II until the mid-1980s.
No kidding. Imagine
a guy gets banged up in 1944, 40 years later, 1984, that's when he retires. So we are on the hook for unbelievable healthcare costs going forward, just from Iraq and Afghanistan. Some from very legitimate injuries, and some from a, potential fraud.
Well, I mean, look, I even experienced it when I was getting out. Guys saying, "Hey, make sure you tell me you have tinnitus. It's 10%. They can't prove it." I mean, to say that doesn't happen would be to be totally honest. We all had tinnitus because we're idiots and we don't wear ear pro when we should.
Look, coming back to the accountability issue, because I think accountability is in having it clearly defined up front is important. I'm a big supporter of the UCMJ instead of trying to try contractors for any malfeasance overseas back in a U.S. court. I think it's a really bad idea to have jurors that can't even find Iraq or Afghanistan on a map trying to sit in judgment of servicemen or ex-servicemen having to make a split-second battlefield decision. Mm-hmm. So our approach, if they adopted my approach in Afghanistan, would be to have a cell of UCMJ lawyers, JAGs, attach them to the embassy or to the military mission there, able to investigate and prosecute any crimes in country with a part of that contingent of U.S. military that remains there, and even a blend of Afghan officers to sit as a jury with sentencing to be carried out in the guy's home of record. Because my other approach is to not just use all Americans, especially for that mentoring role. I want a little competition between the country teams that are doing it. I want the French competing with the Brits, competing with the Germans and the Swedes and the South Africans and the Aussies and the Kiwis. I want the innovation and tactical cunning that comes from some of that national personality to come through there, because the Americans don't have a monopoly on the clever way to wage war, and I want best practices applied. The NATO contribution, I think, has largely been less than effective and ideal in Afghanistan because of all the national restrictions. There are some fantastic warriors from those countries, and if they come as individuals assigned to those 36-man mentor teams, they can do fantastic work.
Whose UCMJ would they be held accountable to?
U.S.
So you'd have just French, for an example, you'd have a French expat come to Afghanistan, serving with Afghans, and if something were to happen, he'd be tried under the American UCMJ, but subject to French punishment?
That would have to be a bilateral agreement between the countries to incarcerate them for the term of that sentence. Yes.
Okay, I'd have to think my way through that one for sure.
Look, just like if an expat goes to join the Legion, he signs on to French military law for doing that. It's really no different.
Actually surrenders an American passport at the end of that process, correct, and receives French citizenship?
They can if they want. A legionnaire that serves the full term is offered French citizenship. In this case, we're not looking at Afghan citizenship, but it would, by serving as a long-term training advisor, it really serves as a skeletal structure support for the Afghan forces.
So to go back, just my mind's been spinning on something just between the private military contractor and the mercenary.
And I mean, maybe just give one other example
sure.
of where it's worked, and I think in an essential way in American history. 1930s, the Japanese invade China, and they're bombing the hell out of them, killing tens of thousands of civilians on a daily basis, bombing cities. The Chinese don't have an effective air force, the nationalist Chinese. And so they turned to a guy named Claire Chennault, who was a retiring Army pilot. They convinced President Roosevelt to issue a secret executive order, which you'd call a presidential finding today, allowing Army, Navy, Marine Corps pilots to leave the service.
Yeah, Flying Tigers.
Go to work for a private company.
Did they actually leave the service, or did they just take their uniform off?
No, they resigned.
Okay.
Yep. They said request leave of the service. Not just leave, but to depart the service. And they left, and the Flying Tigers did very, very well. At a heck of a kill ratio. They stopped a lot of the insanity that the Japanese were able to accomplish before. And then, as the United States rolled into World War II in the Pacific Theater, all those units were absorbed back into the regular forces.
I would suspect because they didn't actually resign from service. I'm aware of a couple of programs that allow individuals to do the same thing. So even though it might have said on paperwork they resigned from service.
I've actually seen, I have a copy of Pappy Boyington's resignation letter to the Marine Corps.
Oh, I have no doubt that the resignation letter exists. Whether or not he actually resigned from the Marine Corps, I think would probably be... And again, it could be debated forever. I'm just saying I've seen programs that allow people to portray something similar to that when in reality they're still an actuary of the U.S. government. So, because we're running out of time. Damn it, I wish I had 3 more hours with you. We have to do like 5 more sessions at some point. So in your mind, mercenaries are a part of, or an inevitable part of warfare when it comes to the United States. And I don't want to speak for you. That's more of a question than a statement.
I think it's literally as old as warfare itself, right? If you were laying siege to an ancient city 800 years ago, the guy who would come and build the trebuchet or the catapults was typically a contractor. That was a contracted engineer. That was a narrow skill set that was rare on the battlefield, and you had to contract for that.
What about the guy firing it, though?
I don't know. Does it really matter?
I think it does. I mean, personally, I think it does.
The guy pulling the rope?
Yeah, the one actually loading and firing the projectile at the enemy combatant.
Look, whether it's privateers, the most of the ships taken during the American Revolution were taken by private ships with private crews, and they were fighting for profit. I mean, they get to attack the enemy ship and got to sell what they captured. And put it this way, Congress even provided for it in the Constitution. Okay, it's called the Letter of Marque and Reprisal. And so I think people ignore history to their detriment, and it is as old as warfare itself. And for the United States to not avail itself of those capabilities, when we've certainly been struggling the last 17 years to put these brush fires out. And there's more countries with brush fire problems now than I can remember in a long time.
Well, we were very effective at what we did. And even though I would say, we roll into Afghanistan with 140,000 people, we certainly denied them the territory long enough that they became much more disaggregate. I mean, I was doing the research on ISIS, and it's hard to tell numbers from 27 to 32 countries that ISIS has a presence, or that there's been an ISIS attack. I mean, I don't think it takes a rocket surgeon to figure out when you come together in large numbers. If the U.S. is searching for you, we're going to send a force in there to find you. So we've driven them almost towards their tactics, techniques, and procedures right now.
Correct. And the fighters that have survived in Afghanistan, imagine if you were 17 in 2001 and now, you're 35. You know exactly how the Americans move and patrol and what their response time is going to be with air and all the rest. They haven't rotated 30 times. They walk to war. They don't have to fly to it. So we have certainly very capable foes, and I think the continuity and the ingenuity. Look, I guess this is a bigger philosophical question, but it's not the American government that made America great. It was always America's private sector, and the private sector ingenuity applied in whether it's developing plastic and plexiglass and the Norden bomb sight, which made high-altitude bombing possible in World War II, or UAVs taken to a whole nother level solely by the private sector. The amount of firearms development and innovation that happens in the basement of a gun designer here in America, that's what makes our armed forces more capable. It's not government ideas and government bureaucracy or the government businesses. And again, like I said earlier, I was very strident about not wanting to look like our government customer. We wanted to be leaner, faster, better, and smoother. And we didn't want to have any excuses about why something couldn't get done. We're going to extend ourselves to make it happen.
Last question for you, because I know we got a hard stop here in about 5 minutes. What are your thoughts on the Geneva Convention?
I think it's people ask me about that. Aren't you worried that when you guys have guys in Iraq or Afghanistan, they're not covered by the Geneva Convention? And I said, it doesn't really concern me when we're fighting, when we're being attacked by an enemy that doesn't even know where Geneva is, let alone that there was a convention there 100 and some years ago. I think it's a wonderful nicety for states to aspire to. Mm-hmm. But again, in big state-on-state war, we're fighting against people that are one step away from total barbarism. Okay, whether if you're an ISIS combatant, you think it's great to slaughter women for going to school, or the horrific whatever they do because they're not their form of extreme Sunni Islam, and so they'll kill Shia, they'll kill Christians, they'll kill Yazidis, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. I don't know that the Geneva Convention has to apply to them because they're certainly not applying to anything approaching any kind of rules of war.
I mean, I think personally the Geneva Convention applies more to us and how we conduct ourselves to make sure that there is a gap in distance between those that we're fighting.
True.
It's, and I asked that question originally just because I find it interesting when we're talking about mercenaries and private military contractors and however people think they may fall in. In '89, it was ratified by almost every country. except for, so three pretty big ones, the UK, Russia, and the United States, as far as the use of mercenaries. And I was just curious as to your thoughts on that.
Well, look, I don't know that, like I said, the Russians are well into...
They're using it pretty effectively.
Availing themselves of the private sector.
Well, that's obviously, and that's why they didn't sign it. I mean, the largest three countries that didn't sign it,
and
I think...
even if the Russians did sign it, would they really have abided by it? I mean, so that's...
I think history would say no.
Well, like Reagan said, trust but verify.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to sign up to all kinds of conventions and serious nation states that want people to aspire to how they conduct themselves. Should certainly try to do that. But it's also dangerous to so hamstring the forces that you expect to go into danger to give them so many Queensberry rules that they're ineffective, and you end up sacrificing your best and brightest on the altar of well-intentioned diplomacy.
I mean, all I can say on that is from my own experience, and I would like to think that at the end of the service I get a clear pass, or not a clear pass, but a clear grade on both the Geneva Convention and the UCMJ. It never stopped me from killing a damn person. And every time I would encounter the enemy, I would kill them, given they met certain metrics. I don't think it hamstrings the U.S. forces. I think it's a convenient, convenient's not the right word. I think it's something that you can point at and say that it is, but I think warfare executed properly inside of those boundaries, it works. But that's my personal experience. It didn't limit me at all, not a single time.
Well, good. Glad to hear it.
We're right at the end of the time we have. Thank you, Mr. Prince, very much for your time and inviting me into your home.
You bet. Thanks for coming.
That is all for this week, ladies and gentlemen. Special thanks to Duke Cannon for supporting this episode of Cleared Hot. If you missed it at the beginning, you can get 15% off your first order and free shipping on orders over $35 at dukecannon.com with your promo code Cleared Hot, all capitals, one word. Promo code Cleared Hot, dukecannon.com. Go get you some. What else? That is about all I have. As always, thank you for the time, energy, and effort to seek out the podcast and listen. I appreciate the feedback. If you haven't done it so far, one thing that would help me out is if you would go to iTunes and leave a review. Rate the podcast and leave the review that you think the podcast deserves. If you think it sucks, write on there, hey, I think this sucks, but do me a favor and tell me why so I can do at least my best to make an improvement. If you think the podcast is awesome, feel free to rate it however you think that would be and say whatever you think you would like to say. Beyond that, if you want to support the podcast, I do sell some very simple t-shirts associated with it. They simply say Cleared Hot on the front, and they have a flag on the left shoulder. If you're interested in picking up those, go to clearedhotpodcast.com. A tab on the top is going to say shop. Click that bad boy and run your credit card to your heart's content. And that is it. Thank you again for all the feedback and the listener-submitted emails. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next week, more than likely, with Volume 1 of Tactical Assholes.